Thank you so much, Julie, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you for pointing out that I've been doing online learning longer than the pandemic. Sometimes I even forget about that. I've actually was one of those rare people that knew what Zoom was like 8 years ago. So the pandemic just made it that much easier for everyone else to sort of find out about online learning. And I'm so grateful for that. I'm really grateful to be here, and I gotta say a big shout out to everyone that typed in the chat where you're zooming in from. That's one of my favorite moments of these massive Zoom calls. I see Los Angeles, California, which is where I grew up. I see Baton Rouge right down the road. I see East Coast, Central. I see the West, everything in between. It's absolutely amazing. What a blessing that technology allows us to be here all together. Springdale, Arkansas, right? Actually, I think some of the Arkansas and Mississippi's on here might be closer than the Baton Rouges to where I am over in Shreveport. I am here to talk to you guys today about Parashat Tazria. That is the weekly parsha that we are at. And normally, if you guys have learned with me before, if you've seen any of my other Parsha Hashavua teachings, I normally like to just dive right into the text and look at everything just right as it is in the words. And just go through. Normally, there's a lot more narrative than there necessarily is in a parsha like Parashat Tazria. So we're going to kind of take a step back before we really dive into Tazria, because there's a particular topic in Parashat Tazria that sometimes gets a bad rap. And it gets a bad rap because these are words that have a lot of baggage because they've evolved over the generations of rabbinic learning and understanding of what we do with various rituals and how things play out, etc. And this will all make sense in just a moment. So let's dive right in here. And I'm going to ask us at a certain point to sort of suspend anything we may already know about the Parsha and see if we can look at this with fresh eyes. I didn't mean to share it like that. I meant to share it like this. Is that showing? Can everybody see that? Thumbs up? Fantastic. All right, let me just make everybody else bigger so I can still see everyone and my screen at the same time here. All right, and feel free at any point in time to write questions in the chat if you have them. Maybe Julie can sort of curate those a little bit in case I miss some. And then at the end, we'll also take a moment for questions. Hopefully, I'll try to leave a couple of minutes for that. All right. Where are we in Torah? Anytime we study Torah, we have to understand context. It can make a huge, huge difference on what's actually happening and what's really meant by the words in the Torah. So we're currently in the midst of a section of Torah in the book of Leviticus, all about purity or cleanliness. Now, those words are English translations of the Hebrew tameh and tahor. I don't know that those are the best translations, right? And we're going to see that as we go through here. However, last week in Parshat Shmini, we were all about diet. It was all about the laws of kashrut, and those same words were used when talking about kosher things, talking about what we can and can't eat. Things that are tameh, you don't eat, and things that are tahor, you can eat. This week, we are on the same topics of tameh and tahor, but we're talking about the health of the body rather than the food we're putting into it. So for a moment, we have to suspend anything we know about the words tameh and tahor, because as I've mentioned, the rabbis, the sages of old, have done a lot of stuff with these words. They now come with a lot of inherent meaning, applying to a lot of different topics. And yet, these words don't exist in Torah before the book of Leviticus, with one very tiny, tiny exception. There are 3 references to the word tameh in the story of Dinah in the book of Genesis. But other than that, Leviticus is where we get the terms. It's where they start, which essentially means that if we're looking at these words tameh and tahor, we're getting the definitions of them right here, right now. So anything that we're going to do with these words later is going to be based on external forces. When we look at Tazria, we're really looking at sort of the original definitions of what these words actually mean, and that's what I want to explore. So if you're somebody who's very knowledgeable about rabbinic literature and you know a lot about the words tameh and tahor, pure and impure, I want to ask you to suspend all of that information. If you're somebody who's never heard those words before in your life, and this is the first time you're hearing them, fantastic. You have a leg up today. So that's the one time, right, where never having learned anything actually benefits you here. So tameh and tahor, these are fresh words. And I'm going to try to use the Hebrew themselves as often as possible so that I don't actually insert in those sort of English, like, oh, is that what it means? But generally speaking, tameh is going to be translated in any English translation that you pick up as either unclean or impure. And tahor is the clean or pure. So they're opposites to one another. But let's see what we actually know about these words. The first time we really get it is earlier in Leviticus. It's Leviticus chapter 5, verse 2. And we get the phrase, O nefesh asher tiga bechol davar tameh. If anyone touches a tameh davar, a tameh thing. Okay, so tameh can be ascribed to things. We know they can be things. Just the next verse later, we get, O chiyiga betumat adam. Or if someone touches the tameh of a person. Okay, so tameh can be a person or it can be a thing, right? It can apply to either. All right, what else do we know? In Leviticus 7:19, this is all pre our parsha today, basar asher yiga bechol tameh lo ye'achel. Okay, and anything that touches something tameh, don't eat it. All right, so we know we don't eat tameh things. Well, that's really good news. If a person can be tameh, I don't want to eat a person, right? So, all right, tameh things, person, thing, don't eat them. Anything else? V'habasar kol tahor yochal basar. If the flesh of anything tahor, you can eat it. Great. Opposite of don't eat is you can eat. Things that are tameh, we don't eat. The opposite, tahor, you can eat them. Now, people can also be tahor, by the way, but still don't eat them. All right. Then we get to last week's parsha. Last week's parsha was all about kashrut, all about the animals we can eat and not eat. So, einenu mafris tamehu lachem. This was actually in context about the camel was the example of a particular animal that you can't eat. And one of the reasons was that all the animals have to have split hooves. We're not going to go into that today. The point is, non-kosher animals through all of chapter 11, they're all described as tameh. They all have this status of don't eat them. Furthermore, these things that are tameh, anything or anyone who touches it shall also then be tameh. Okay, now this is something interesting. This is a new piece of information that Leviticus chapter 11 gave us. So not only can people and things be tameh, and not only do they have to do with eating and not eating them, but the status of tameh can transfer between people and between things, whatever this tamehness is, which we're going to see a little bit in just a moment. So what do you do if you're tameh? Yechabes begadav v'tameh ad ha'arev. Okay, so one washes their clothes and they stay tameh only until evening. So we learn in Leviticus 11 that tameh is temporary, or at least it can be temporary, certainly here for people. Then, bechol kli cheres yitma ve'oto tishboru. An earthen vessel that is tameh, you shall break them. Okay, so tameh can also be permanent. It can be temporary or permanent. This, by the way, is the same sort of notion that we have in modern day kashrut, modern day laws of kosherness, that, for example, a ceramic plate, if it's made not kosher, can't be made kosher again, whereas a glass plate or a metal plate can. So we see that even in modern day sort of understanding of making things usable versus not usable. So what do we know before going into this week's parsha? We know it can be a person or thing. We know you can't eat tameh. We know it can be permanent or temporary. And we know it can transfer. And that's pretty much all we know until Parashat Tazria. And that's where we pick up today. Parashat Tazria gives us 11 different scenarios 11 different scenarios involving the body that are going to have to do with tamenus and tahornus. We open in chapter 12, verses 2 through 4, and then it jumps a little to 6 to 8, with a scenario of a woman who gives birth to a male child. Now, again, this is the first time the word tameh is really being ascribed to a person outside of just touching something tameh. And what we learn, and I'm not going to go through all of the Hebrew here because it's very redundant and it's very repetitive, so I've just given us some summaries here. But I've given the verses in case you want to look it up on your own here. She becomes tameh for 7 days. So the moment the child is born, this woman takes on the status of tameh, which again, we don't know what that means yet, but she takes on the status of tameh. On the 8th day, because this was a male child, that's the Brit Milah, that's when we have circumcision. And then she continues to be tameh for 33 total days. At the end of those 33 days, there's a ritual in which she comes to the priest, they do a particular type of sacrifice, and then she loses her tameh status. She goes back to being tahor, just like she was before giving birth to the child. So this is one of those temporary moments. Now, that sounds really weird and confusing and what's actually going on there, and I'm going to ask us to hold on to that confusion for just a moment while we make it a little more confusing first, and then we'll come back and I promise I'll answer it, okay? Because the very next scenario is that if a woman gives birth to a female child. Somebody wrote 40 days total, same as the period of seclusion that they do in some other cultures. Aha, Aaron Rosenthal, you are picking up on something very, 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 very key here. So hold on to that thought, Yasher Koach. We're going to come back to that. Now, there's something super weird in this next couple of verses, which is that it goes through the exact same scenario for a woman who gives birth to a female child as it was a male child. The only difference, though, is that the timing is doubled. The rabbis have gone through all sorts of loops and crazy things to try to figure out why is this doubled for a female child versus a male child. And honestly, it all has to do with ancient understanding of medicine. And we're not going to go down that road right now because, quite frankly, it's not really relevant. It's one of those weird biblical things. We could have a whole other thing. So somebody wrote she gives birth to a potential birth giver that they total add on. That's one of those rabbinic things that the rabbis like to come up with these cool reasons for, or maybe not so cool reasons. We're going to sort of bypass that because we could spend our entire hour just on that question. And I don't want to do that today. So Carol asked a really, really great question here. Are there provisions about miscarriages or stillborn children? So I'm just going to take a moment to unshare my screen here as I say this, just to give that question the sort of weight that it deserves, which is that Judaism has a lot to say about childbirth. In fact, it's the very first commandment in the entire Torah. Pru uravu, have kids. It's definitely seen as a beautiful, wonderful, amazing thing. Judaism has nothing negative to say about pregnancy or birth. It's absolutely an amazing thing. And our sages do not shy away from the very real traumas that are associated sometimes with childbirth. That can be miscarriage, that can be stillborn, that can be death of the parent. There's so much trauma that is potential in this. And for anybody on this call who's ever experienced that or known someone who's experienced that, from the bottom of my heart, I truly have nothing but compassion for you. Yes, Judaism has a lot to say on those subjects. We're not going to go over them here. All I want to share is that in every step of the way, the intention is for compassion. The intention is understanding and being there and supporting one another. And we're going to see a little bit of that here, not on those specific issues, but in general, just to share for anyone who's wondering, yes, our tradition has a lot to say on the subject of what we'll call non-standard healthy birth. A lot to say on those subjects, not in this parsha. In this parsha, we're going to go back to the screen here. We just have these two scenarios. Woman gives birth, she's tameh for a little while, and then she has a ritual to come back, and then she's tahor again. We're going to hold on to that thought. Because the very next chapter, which is the very next verse, is chapter 13. And the rest of these scenarios have to do with a physical ailment. And so one of the things that very often happens when we see two topics in Torah right next to each other is people try to conflate the two. And they say, oh, well, if chapter 13 is about disease, then we must be saying that chapter 12 is about a disease, and therefore pregnancy is a disease. That it could not be farther from the truth. Because if we were going to play that game, then we would have to conflate it to the chapter before that, which was about kosher things. So what, are we supposed to eat diseases? Right? So this is one of those moments where, because the wording is similar in different scenarios, it's very easy to try to conflate these different things and try to sort of make them all one topic. But as we're going to see, they're so drastically different from one another in scenario that we can't do that with the words tameh and tahor. We have to look at them in their own contexts. And so far we have two. We're about to have three. The first is food, our diet. The second is pregnancy. And the third is disease. Three completely separate scenarios that all happen to use the words tameh and tahor. So we have to learn about what those words mean, not what those things have in common necessarily. Well, to a certain extent, but not the way that we're thinking about it. So I'm going to go through these 11 scenarios a little bit quickly because there's a lot of nuance to them, and the Torah is very, very dense here. And anybody who wants to read it directly from the text will know instantly what I mean. It's very confusing to kind of piece it out. But basically, here's scenario one. A person has some sort of inflammation, some sort of rash, some sort of skin condition, and that skin condition becomes sort of a discolored whiteness. The very first thing they do is they report it to the priest. The priests are the ones who at the time are going to be, I guess, what we'll call our medical experts. Not because they're necessarily medical experts, but because they're the ones that are seeing everyone on a regular basis. They're going to look at the rash, and if there are white hairs in the rash, then that individual is deemed to have some sort of condition, and they're deemed tameh. If the whitening is only surface level on the deep, then they do something interesting. They quarantine the person for 7 days. We certainly have no idea anything about quarantine, right, guys? And if there's no change in the condition after 7 days, they're quarantined for an additional 7 days. 2 weeks of quarantine. All right, something sounding familiar. The idea here being that regardless, not better, not worse, it stays the same, they're monitoring. If it shows signs of healing, they wash their clothes, they're good to go, they're tahor. If it spreads, they're tameh. And if it was healing, but it comes back, they do it all over again. To me, that sounds fairly normal, right? That's a fairly standard medical procedure here. Obviously nothing fancy, nothing advanced technologies, no crazy medicines. But what are you doing? You're checking to see if somebody has an actual condition, somebody who's seen it before, who knows what it looks like. They're monitoring the scenario. And if there's an issue, they're being called tameh. And if there's no issue, they're called tahor. All right. The second thing is very, very similar. An individual has a scaly rash. This is some sort of different type of disease, some sort of different type of rash. If there's a white swelling, some white hairs, and some skin that has no discoloration, here's what's really interesting. They're deemed tameh here, but they don't need to quarantine. This is some sort of chronic condition. Maybe this is something like an eczema or something that comes and goes. I don't know why. I'm not an expert in ancient medical issues. We could try to spend an entire hour just trying to figure out with some doctors, like, what are each of these things? By the way, if you want to see all of these laid out next side by side, Julie just put a link in the chat to the source sheet, has all of the information that I've got up on the screen, is also compiled in a single sheet for you. But same thing here. If there's something wrong, they're tameh. If they're healthy, they're tahor. If the person has boils and those boils had healed, but it has left some sort of marking, if it's a condition, they're tameh. If it's just scar tissue, they're tahor. And again, I'm going through these really quickly. Same thing if they suffered from a burn, and the burn, anybody who's ever seen a burn victim knows that sometimes that can leave a lot of scarring, some deep scarring. If it's just scar tissue, they're good to go, it's tahor. If it's some sort of other issue, some sort of infection, they're tameh. If the individual has a rash on their head or on their face, right? Same thing, but looking for different things. Again, we're getting into sort of the weeds here of the medical differences between one and the other. And I'm no expert on crazy ancient medical problems that may or may not even exist anymore. But the same concept sort of plays out. We're just keep going through these different medical scenarios. Same thing, streaks of white discoloration. And then I think we get to my favorite one here. Yeah, this is my favorite one. Our Torah asks the question, what if you're going bald? Right? Is that a problem? Teacher, what do I do? What do I do? My hair is falling out. And I love this one because we see a shift in the language in the Torah here for the first time, which is for the first time, the Torah does not say, go talk to a priest. For the first time, the Torah says, if you're bald or balding, you're tahor. Get out of here. You're fine. That's normal, right? So, but we can imagine ancient medicine and someone losing their hair and maybe didn't have a grandparent who lost their hair and had never seen this before, and they're freaking out like, oh my gosh, am I sick? And so the Torah comes in to be like, no, that's normal. You're okay. However, if there's a cause for it, i.e. there was some sort of rash that's appearing where you're balding because that infection was causing the hair loss, then we go back to the same procedures, talking to a priest. They look for whatever the condition is. If there's a condition, they're tameh. If there's no condition, they're tahor. Everyone kind of getting the pattern here? All right, if you're sick, tameh. If you're not sick, tahor. So what happens if you're tameh? This is the crux. This is what we've been waiting for. What does it mean to be tameh? They do a few things. Number one, they tear their clothes like a mourner. Anybody who's ever seen kriyah for mourning, tearing of clothes for mourning, knows that the function of this is so that other people know the condition you're in. As a mourner, that condition is sad. Then there's this word they're supposed to do of farua. They're supposed to parua their heads. This is a huge debate in rabbinic scholarship, what this word means. The rabbis love to argue with each other because it either means that they're supposed to shave their head or it means they're not supposed to touch their hair. Don't comb it, don't wash it, don't trim it, don't do anything. So it either means one thing or the opposite. We're not really sure. But they do something with their hair to, again, let people know that they're in some sort of condition that is separate from their normal state. They cover their mouths, right? i.e. wear a mask. They publicly announce their status as tameh. They let the community know, hey, by the way, I'm in a state of tamehness. And then they quarantine outside the camp as long as they are tameh. So what's going on here? We're seeing multiple things. We're seeing tameh not as a negative, not as an unclean or an impure, but rather as a status that is outside their normal way of being. In the case of a disease, clearly we want to prevent that from spreading. There's notions of quarantine, there's notions of masks, there's notions of staying far from one another, there's notions of acknowledging it so people know who you are. There's also, yes, exactly, as Luke just wrote in the chat here, stopping the spreading and taking care of other people. What we don't have in our Torah is, by the way, if you're tameh, keep it to yourself and hide. What we have is announce it to the world. Tell people. It's not so that you can be a pariah, so they can look at you and say, oh my gosh, stay away, rah, right? It's so they can say, wow, I need to take care of you. I need to pay attention. You're not going to be able to go to the grocery store and buy food for yourself. I'm going to get you some. The priest goes back and checks on them over and over and over again. We have to know when that disease has been cleared so they can come back and we can welcome them back. And then there's even a ritual designed to force them back. Now let's look at it again back in that case of the pregnancy, of the giving birth. This is not someone who is sick in the sense of having a disease, but is certainly, as any mothers here have experienced, is in a state that is outside the standard state of being, and is one where chances are you probably don't want to interact with too many people anyway right after childbirth. So it's a built-in system. And then they have to come back. You're not allowed to feel like a pariah in your tamenus, because when your tamenus is over, whether that's the designated period for childbirth or the coming back after the disease has gone, you are required, says the Torah, to bring a sacrifice. Lest you be alone for so long that you think no one cares about you, we demand your presence again. Your tahorness, you're coming back into your status of whatever is normal for your life, is celebrated. I love that translation. There's somebody wrote in the chat, if I'm understanding me correctly, if I'm understanding you, me, Rabbi Feivel, correctly, tameh can be understood as vulnerable. I love that translation. I really, really do. Because if we look at vulnerable as that translation, and we look at it even in the sense of food, right, that we saw earlier last week, that in food, the foods are vulnerable foods, i.e. it's easy to not pay attention to what we're eating. It's easy to just ignore the nuance of what it means to be a part of a particular community with a particular set of rules. And so even eating the food makes you vulnerable, because you have then now separated yourself from the culture of what everyone else is eating, right? I love that term of vulnerable. There's another question here by Buzz Lightyear. I love that. Does tahor have any important meaning in the letters? So the letters tet, he, and resh, especially the first time in Leviticus 7:19. Great question. I don't think I have an answer for that right now. I'll need to sit with that, with the letters of tahor. That's a good question, though. So let's finish Parashat Tazria, and then I'm going to touch on one other thing here. There's one more scenario here, which again, we shift gears again. We went from food to childbirth to disease, and now to actually not people at all. We're now on fabrics, because apparently fabrics can also have some sort of infection, at least the natural ones, linen, cloth, skins, same exact process. If it's fixable, they can cut it out, they can clean it. If it's not fixable, they destroy it, because unlike people, things are disposable. And that's another beautiful distinction that we see with these words tameh and tahor. If we were going to only use tameh as this horrible negative thing because, oh, well, if something is tameh, you have to destroy it, then what would that say about a person that's tameh? So again, we have to separate these two notions, because clearly we have a different set of rules for a tameh person versus a tameh thing versus a tameh food versus tameh. It's not a simple concept. And so the one thing that they all have in common is the care. It's the care that goes into it. It's the focus. It's the attention. It's the needing to do something differently. In a modern day word, I call that mindfulness. Something that we have so deeply embedded in our tradition. When we say brachot, when we say blessings, we're not actually thanking God. We're saying, blessed are you, Adonai. We're acknowledging what God does. We're being mindful. When something is tameh, when someone is tameh, when they are vulnerable, when they are outside their normal scope of what it means to be who they are, we need to pay attention to that. And that's the lesson of Parashat Tazria. That's the concept of tameh and tahor. That's how it affects us each and every day. There's one more teaching I want to share with us on this subject, that comes from a very, very minor tractate of smachot. Somebody wrote mental health ? Yeah, I would put that into this category as well, right? It's anything that is putting you in a scenario, at least in a modern day sensibilities. Obviously, the Torah is not going to address that. It's a little bit, we didn't quite have the information back then, but certainly mental health in today's world would fall into the same category of a vulnerable position where you're outside the scope of your normal functionality as you. And again, not to compare one person to another ever, but to compare someone to themselves, right? What is your normal, and when are you outside your normal? Exactly, normal being subjective, someone wrote, exactly, 100%. That's why, yeah, your normal, not the normal. But there's one more teaching that I want to share on this subject, which really brings in the sort of a communal care piece of this all. And this comes from a section of Talmud that many of you have probably never even heard of. It's a minor tractate called Smachot. It's not even in the set of Talmud that I have behind me. It's one of these super itty bitty things outside. In chapter 6, it talks about the temple. And it talks about how when people came to the temple, what they would do is everyone would walk around the temple in the same direction. They would all walk around clockwise, all to the right, with one exception. Or sorry, with one set of exceptions, which is what this one is talking about here. These are those who must go around to the left. They go around the other direction. A mourner, an excommunicated person, and someone who has a sick person in their house, and someone who lost an object. Now, lest you think that these people are being punished, lest you think they're supposed to be a pariah and everyone's supposed to walk the other direction so that they know who to avoid, the Talmud actually explains further. Why do you go around the left? They ask each one of these people. If they answer, because I'm a mourner, you have to respond with, may he who dwells in this house, i.e. may God, comfort you. If he says, because I'm under a ban, they reply, may God put it in their hearts to draw you near. And if you're somebody who has a sick person in their house, may God have mercy upon the sick. And if there's barely living, may God have mercy upon the sick immediately. So what's the reason why everyone walks the opposite direction? So that you can see them and offer them your own compassion. You're forced as part of a community to confront those in your community who need you. We can't shy away from one another. Our tradition demands that we live with one another in harmony and in compassion. That one day we will need others, and we hope they'll be there for us. And when we are not in need, we can be there for them. That's the spirit of our tradition. That's the spirit of our Torah. And quite frankly, that's the true spirit, I believe, of the words tameh and tahor. I'm going to just throw this up on the screen really quickly here. That's all I have for you today. I really appreciate you guys taking the time to learn with me. We're going to take a couple of questions here before we actually close. But I just want to say, in case anybody has to run beforehand, if you enjoyed this learning, tell a friend. As Julie mentioned, I teach all year round through my nonprofit Freelance Judaism. We've got a class coming up in April on calculating the Jewish calendar. If you like math, this is a class that you're going to love. If you hate math, I'd stay away from it. But thank you so much. Also, if anybody has any questions after this, and I'll put these in the chat as well, my website is freelancejudaism.com, and my email is feivel@freelancejudaism.com. You can always reach out to me anytime, day or night. I'll respond as soon as I see it. But I'll take this off the screen for right now and field any questions that people have. Julie, do you want to call on people? How should we do this?
Sure, yeah. So Mark, you want to go ahead and unmute and ask your question?
Yes, no, maybe.
You're still muted, Mark. All right, Mark, as you're figuring that out, we'll have Ginger, please.
I'm a little unclear. How can fabric be tameh?
Oh,
Is it?
Yeah.
Is there certain colors that make it tameh? Is it the
that's
bling of the?
a really, really great question. And in fact, next week's Parshat Mitzorah, goes all about a house that's tameh. They're really, really weird. So in for Parashat Tazria, it talks about if there are streaks of green or red in the fabric, obviously that are not a part of the fabric itself, but if there's like somehow green or red, I like to think about it almost like a mold. That's the best way that I can kind of imagine it in modern day terms, is because when we talk about Metzora, especially next week, when we talk about the houses being tameh, the walls have some sort of infection on them. The best way that I can sort of visualize that is there's some sort of mold that's growing and spreading. Because whatever this infection is, it has the ability to spread. And that's the only thing I know of that can spread on inorganic things or like stones of a wall. Good question.
And it looks like Mark is not unmuted. Go ahead, Mark.
Okay, thank you for the teaching. Why are there no herbal remedies for tameh?
Oh, that's such a great question. Herbal remedies. Honestly, there may have been. There may have been some herbal remedies for dealing with the actual disease in terms of talking about the diseases that were listed. They may have had some herbal remedies. What our Torah really was just dealing with, though, was the notion of determining whether or not somebody actually was sick to begin with. So I think it was more about diagnosis than it was treatment. I don't think our Torah talks too much about treatment, though. I will say our Talmud loves herbal remedies. I've always wanted to write a book of potions and spells from the Talmud. There's a ton of herbal stuff in the Talmud when we talk about actual remedies. Here in our Torah, we're really focused on two things. We're focused on diagnosis, and we're focused on when that has been recovered, what is the process for returning? So what's happening in between, how someone's going from being either unhealthy to healthy, or from being tired to not tired, or from whatever status of whatever caused their tamehness to not being that status anymore. That's sort of missing in the Torah. But I would be shocked if there weren't, if we couldn't find out there some sort of ancient remedies for some of these things. Good question. I see Esther.
Esther, I see you have your hand raised. If you want to go ahead and unmute.
Oh, also, while she's unmuting here, Sophie S. wrote in the chat, bacterial and viral infections can also reside in fabrics. That's interesting. So there you go.
Yeah, I find a connection between this week's parasha to last week and for an old parasha. Last week, we talked about kashrut, so it's things that we put into the mouth. This week, we talk about lashon hara, so it's things that come out of our mouth. And the second connection is when Moses goes to Pharaoh and he tells him about the 10 makot, he talks about bechorot, the last plague, as the first one. And in this parasha, they talk about the skin first, and then, then the clothes, and then the house. So it goes the other way. And my second comment was about the Kohen. Could it be that they went to the Kohen for spiritual guidance? Because some of skin diseases come out of emotion.
Yeah, I love that for both of your comments here. So Esther, just for those that didn't catch the nuance there, was referencing the Hebrew word for these skin conditions in this week's parsha is called tzara'at, and Rashi likes to talk about the cause of tzara'at being lashon hara. It's a play on the word, and how speaking ill of other people can cause yourself physical distress. When you harm others, you actually harm yourself.
Like Miriam.
Like Miriam, correct. Like Miriam we see elsewhere in Torah. So she was playing off of that connection between food being put into your mouth and gossip coming out of your mouth, which is a lovely connection. And then also sort of the opposite way of talking about the order of things in the plagues in Egypt versus now. So we've sort of come full circle there. Brilliant connections there. I love that. To your second point about why the Kohanim, why are they going to the priests? I made a comment, maybe these are sort of medical experts of the time, but Esther brought up, well, perhaps they were actually really there in order to ensure they had spiritual support. And that's actually something I was just talking last night with my wife about, who Julie mentioned is also a rabbi. We were actually just discussing the need for, in today's world, how sometimes there is a disconnect between the emotional and spiritual care a person needs when in a hospital versus the medical care that they need, and how those two things are always best, a person is always best served when they get both of those, both the medical care and the emotional spiritual care, and how beautiful it is that in our Torah, the person who gave the physical care was also the people who gave the spiritual care, that perhaps those are people who, at least when you had a small enough community, knew the individuals well enough to know and to be able to discern what type of care they needed. In today's world, we sometimes have that a little bit more segmented, right? And you go to one doctor for one type of care and another doctor for another type of care and another doctor for another type of care. Certainly, if you're anything like me, you do. I've got like 3 doctors. So if that's, what would it be like if we actually had somebody specialized to do all of that for an individual? Of course, today's medical world, we have so much more information than they did back then. I don't know how feasible that is to have one doctor for everything, or that we'd even want that anymore. But certainly it's a lovely idea that spiritual care would have been just as important in their growth and healing as medical care or an herbal remedy or any of those other things. So 100%, I think that's one of the reasons why the priests were probably the ones to disseminate this information.
Rabbi Feivel, do you have time for one more question?
I do, if you do.
Great. So Gerald, you'll be the last question. Thanks.
Rabbi, the concept of contagion, as you've described, the state of tameh can be passed on by touching or other ways. And my question deals with the role of the priest. The priest, it seems to me, has a sacred obligation to protect the Beit HaMikdash from contamination. That is a big, big deal, and is part of the quarantine approach to keep these people who are tameh from entering the temple, where if they contaminated the temple, the sanctification of it probably is a very big deal.
So this is a really, really lovely question, as were all of the questions fielded today, and I so appreciate all of them. So what Gerald is bringing up here is the Kohanim, the priests, as gatekeepers, right? This notion that their responsibility is to pay attention to the needs of the temple, the needs of the tabernacle when they're in the desert, and to make sure that that does not become contaminated either by physical disease or by someone who has violated something else and is in some sort of state of tamehness. And so we could look at this. We could make the argument, as Gerald is asking about, well, maybe it's really less about taking care of the individual and more about just kind of keeping them away. And to that, what I would love to point to is, and let's see, is it in, I think it's in Parashat Mitzorah. I think it's at the very end of Mitzorah. Let me just see real quickly here. Yeah, so in chapter 15, verse 31, which is not in this week's Parsha, but next week's, we get V'hizartem et b'nei Yisrael mitumatam. Make sure the Israelites are cautious regarding their own tameh status. And what I love about that sentence is I actually think it takes the power away from the priests and it makes it more individual. Because what our Torah is saying here is that you, as the individual, are responsible ultimately for not violating the temple when you know you're not in a pure enough state to be in the temple. The responsibility is on us as individuals. Yes, the priests are gatekeepers. Yes, their goal is to do that, but they're not police officers. It's not their job to say, oh, well, I need to inspect every single person and make sure they're tahor before they come in because I need your tahor card because otherwise it's my fault that you got let in. That ultimately, if someone if somebody violates the sanctuary, the blame doesn't fall on the priests, it falls on the individual. And I think there's something really special in that it allows the priests to actually care for the individual because they're part of the community and not because they're a gatekeeper to the temple. So I would argue, Gerald, that that's not the role of the priests to sort of be that gatekeeper. I would like to argue, and I'm sure I've got colleagues who would go the other direction because there is a very compelling argument to be made the other way, but I would argue that the Torah is very good about giving individual responsibility for making mistakes, and that the only time we're responsible for one another is actually when we're making amends on behalf of one another, that we don't actually necessarily get the blame ourselves. I mean, let me back that up. We do have communal responsibilities for sure, and we need to make sure one another are responsible for one another. Leviticus 19 in a few weeks says, surely you shall rebuke one another, and also you shall not have hate in your heart towards one another, in the same sentence. So there is this notion of making sure people are taking on their own responsibilities, but at the same time, ultimately, you're responsible for yourself in terms of making sure you're not doing anything wrong, and everybody else is responsible for actually taking care of you when you need to be taken care of. And that's what I think is the role of the priest here, is to be able to say to everyone, this person needs our support. Which, by the way, is also how I view the role of the rabbi today, is the individual who gets to know you, who gets to say to everybody else, hey, by the way, this person needs our support. It's why we have a Misha Berach list. It's why we have a tradition to stand for the mourner's Kaddish. It's why we have a whole set of traditions designed to make people actually lift up their eyes and see one another. And I hope that that's the message we really take away from today and from the Torah as a whole. So I know that was our last question, so I'll just say again, thank you so much to everybody who came here and listened and participated. And it is truly such a pleasure to get to see all of you. And I hope I get to learn with you all once more again. And again, if you want to continue this conversation or have any other questions, Feivel at freelancejudaism.com. Feivel spelled like the little mouse that went west.